There's some helpful tips on the screen to let you do that, and we're going to get started in just a couple of seconds here. Before we get started today, we'd like to ask just a quick polling question, which you should see on your screen shortly. This will give us a good idea who's attending, and it'll help our presenter gauge your level of experience to frame our discussion today. Our first question is, how much experience do you have with qualitative research? No experience, a little experience, some experience, or a lot of experience? Go ahead and click on the answer that best represents your level of experience with qualitative research. I'll give you just a couple more seconds here to complete that question, and then we'll move forward. Okay, let's go ahead and close that poll. Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us today for our webinar. It's the latest in our new Sage Talk series, Successful Qualitative Research, Don't Get Too Comfortable. Just like my slides, shouldn't get too comfortable. Sorry about that. If any of you have any problems with audio or viewing during the webinar, please use our chat box on the GoToMeeting menu, and one of our team members will get back to you as soon as possible. My name is Nicole Elliott, and I'm the Executive Marketing Manager for Research Methods, Statistics, and Evaluation here at Sage, and we are delighted to welcome Kristi Jackson to our Sage Talk series today. With more than 20 years of experience, Kristi is an active expert and trainer on qualitative data analysis software and qualitative research methods. Kristi holds a Master's of Education degree from the University of Vermont and a Doctorate of Philosophy in Education from the University of Colorado. Kristi became the Vice President of an evaluation firm in Denver in 1999 and established Query in 2002. She spends a third of her time collecting data for evaluation research projects, primarily in the education and health fields, a third of her time using NVivo to analyze data, and a third of her time consulting with and training other researchers. Now, I assume she needs another third somewhere to take care of things like going to the grocery store and sleeping, but since this is a qualitative webinar, I'll leave the math out of it. Along with Pat Baisley, she has co-authored the most recent Sage book on qualitative data analysis with NVivo, and she is a principal organizer of the Digital Tool Strand at the International Congress of Qualitative Inquiry, which was just held with our annual meeting last week. Her current research interests include conceptualizations of transparency in the qualitative research process, particularly among doctoral students in their dissertation committee. Now, before we get started, I want to let you know that this 1-hour webinar will be recorded and archived for future viewing. The PowerPoint slides you're viewing will also be made available on our website at sagepub.com/sagetalks. We'll be sending out the link to the recording and the PowerPoint slides to all registrants via email after the event, and we'll also be sending out a post-webinar survey to get your feedback about what you thought of the webinar and what you'd like to see in our future webinars. Please do take a moment to complete that survey when it comes to you, as I greatly appreciate your feedback. At the end of the webinar, we'll have some time for questions with Kristi, so please use the chat box in the GoToMeeting toolbar to ask any questions to Kristi or myself throughout the webinar. Excuse me. Please also take note of the webinar hashtag. It's hashtag SageTalks, that's all one word, SAGETALKS. And feel free to tweet any questions or comments throughout the webinar to our Twitter handle, which is @sage_methods. And finally, if at the end of the webinar you're interested in purchasing any of the titles that we mentioned today at a 20% discount, you may do so by using the promotional code Jackson20, that's all one word, JACKSON20, on the website during checkout. Again, that's Jackson20 for the 20% discount, which will be good through June 27th of this year, 2015. During our time today, Kristi is going to speak about 7 tendencies she's seen across qualitative research, focusing on just one of these in detail, which is flexibility. With a focus on flexibility, she'll explore 3 metaphors that illustrate this concept in different ways, through participant language, presenting findings, and as part of the qualitative research process. It is her goal to help you understand the metaphor of qualitative research with an open mind as a journey, learning to approach it as a fun, engaging, and exciting ride. And after we hear from Kristi, we'll move on to a Q&A session where Kristi will answer those questions that you've submitted via the chat box, as well as those that you've posted on Twitter using the Sage Talks hashtag. We'll do our best to get to all of the questions answered, but if we're not able to get to all of them today, we'll allow Kristi the opportunity to respond to those offline, and we'll include that link after the event. And without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Kristi. Welcome.
Thank you, Nicole. Okay, so before I begin, I would like to thank several scholars who really helped lay the groundwork for some of this thinking. The first two are people who've done work in qualitative data analysis software and have helped me think about closeness and distance in the research process. The next two are scholarship in metaphor, which really helped me critically think about how I use closeness and distance. And the last two provide really good examples of using metaphor as part of the research process. And in particular, I think if some of this talk gives you ideas and you want to explore them further, the Metaphors We Live By book has a lot of examples of ways to look at metaphor in everyday talk. And then the last one, Thinking Qualitatively, Methods of Mind, in particular the Thinking Artistically chapter is one that I think will give you a lot of ideas. So I want to both provide my thanks and also give these as a place for you can do some more thinking later. Okay, so although some of the people on the line now do have experience in qualitative research, I wanted to set the stage for why I'm diving into this idea of flexibility with 7 tendencies that I've observed in the process. And these aren't absolutes. I'm not really trying to define qualitative research with precision. I'm just trying to get us oriented. So first, I think I see this most often in social science research. I think it often has to do with holistic or comprehensive understandings of social settings, that it occurs in naturalistic settings rather than environments where things are being controlled, and that there tends to be a pursuit of how and why questions over the kinds of questions that simply ask what. This is one where I often have to give an example, so let me give a quick one here. If I have statistics in a community about dropout rates, and I look at the trends over time and I see what those numbers look like, that's one piece of information. But it could be that it's not until I talk to students who've dropped out or their families that I might find out that the context of bullying in schools was a factor, or lack of resources for teen parents, that could be a factor. And in fact, some of those research findings have come out in the last few years, and they've reframed the label of dropout to a new label that's sometimes called push out. The thought that perhaps some students are feeling pushed out of school instead of dropping out. And that has really significant implications for how programs evolve and how students are treated. That's just an example of the kind of how and why question that qualitative research can address. Next, we're talking about primarily unstructured data, a lot of audio, video, observations in the field, could be some text. And then the last two, which I've highlighted here in bold, there's a very complex craft of linking research questions, theories, and methods. I'm going to talk about that for just a second in my next slide. And flexibility, and that ranges from the research questions all the way through the reporting. The flexibility is the part that I'm going to get to as the focus of this talk. Before I do that, let's talk about this complex craft of linking questions, theories, and methods. So I have a quick diagram here that I use often to separate out different aspects in the arena of qualitative work. And the first one is the tools. Those are the things that you use to handle data, whether it's collecting it or analyzing it. Then there are methods, and those, I consider those tactics or strategies, ways that you use those tools to handle data. I think of methodologies as more complex sets of methods, and this is the place where you're going to find a lot of books. There's books on all of these methodologies, and there's differences of opinion about how they can be used. Next are theories, and there are a lot of theories. Remember that here I'm just giving you examples in this slide. I'm not talking about an exhaustive list. And I think of theories as sort of unified, systematic explanations of social phenomena, and these can get quite complex. And then finally, epistemologies. And epistemology is a study of the nature of knowledge and justification. So this becomes the most ethereal and philosophical of these components. But what you're going to find in qualitative methods is that when faculty, for instance, work with students, there's a lot of discussion on how these are crafted and how they fit together. You'll see at the top I have arrows that run between these. So these aren't really clear camps. They're blurry lines between them, so I've listed them here kind of heuristically just as a tool to discuss it. And they can be cobbled together in all sorts of interesting ways and very diverse ways depending on the research question. Okay, so next is flexibility. Now, I just talked about the diverse array of things people might cobble together to address a research question. But when I'm talking about flexibility now, I want to talk about how broadly or narrowly to focus the study, but not just as a design issue. It's actually as a journey. As you move through the process, how flexible to be. I think this is another key consideration in framing a study, and it's another common place that there are conversations between new researchers and their mentors. What I want to do next is turn to some aspects of the research design and the practice that could help frame the study by thinking about this broad to narrow focus and how to be flexible within it. Okay, so the first example I have is time. So it could be that you're doing a microethnography, which is usually quite short, and microethnography is a way of looking at big social patterns by attending to more immediate communications and behaviors, whereas the longer view could be a larger arc of time. It could be a historical study, and it's likely to have historical events as touch points. And so what I'm asking you to do as you look at this slide and the next slide is to think through where you might start on this spectrum, but what I want you to do is be ready to move. That is, there will be things that will come up as the research unfolds that have you adjust where you are on the spectrum, and that's what I want to get you in tune with. So the next is the focus of the study. It could be that you're going to look at a system, which would be a complex network of educational, political, economic, or cultural dynamics, or it could be that you're focusing on one element or person as they navigate through that structure or through those complex networks. Once again, I'm asking you to think about where you might start, but then be ready to move along this spectrum to think about it with a different lens. The third one is the activity. Are you looking at an incident? And that could be something like a human rights march or a natural disaster or a common issue like clean water that brings a group together. Or are you looking at a tradition? And that's something that's more likely to be a long-standing, repeated event that has consistent structural components and people enact it with some kind of predictability. And then finally, the vantage point. Do you want to look from an insider perspective? And that's by talking to people who are intimately involved in the setting. They're probably people who are the core of the social network that work in this environment. Or do you want to look from the perspective of outsiders? And those are people who see things from the periphery and have a different view because they look at things from the periphery. So I've identified 4 possibilities of ways to think about moving. One is time from a macro perspective to a long perspective. One is the focus on systems or on particular elements. The other is activities. Do you want to look at particular incidents or longer traditions? And then finally, the vantage point from the insider or outsider. These are by no means exhaustive, but they'll give you a place to start. So with that, we're going to turn to a polling question, and I'll hand it back over to Nicole.
Thanks, Kristi. You know, in looking at this, could you maybe give us an example of each of those opportunities and where you may have found yourself being flexible, or maybe just pick one or two of them where you could give a good example of that?
Sure. Let me think for a second based on some of the studies I've worked in recently.
I'm putting you on the spot, sorry.
No, that's okay, because I think it's good to come up with some examples. I think actually, you know, to tie it into the dropout example that I provided early on, that initial study was really around looking at, in Denver, a very small group of students at a particular school and how they were experiencing the dropout process. And we were actually amazed to find, and perhaps shouldn't have been, how many of them were teen parents, and it was both the girls and the boys who were talking, or I should say young women and young men, who were talking about wishing they had more resources at school to be able to be good parents and good students at the same time. And once we picked up on that pattern and then started looking at stories that were not in this local setting, that ranged across the country, and at changes over time in teen birth rates and what it was like for students to navigate being a parent, we were able to put it in a much bigger context. So, you know, part of the issue with that is trying to figure out how much to generalize, how big to go, and how big to look. But the pattern was so striking in that small setting of that incident of just that school or group of schools and how the students were dealing with it, to look at a bigger setting of what this might mean for the public school system. That's an example of when we tried to traverse.
That's a great example. Very, very applied. So let's pull up our polling question here. In thinking about your own qualitative research, for those of you who are joining us on the phone, you might be preparing to conduct this research, or you might be in this research, but which of the four dynamics that Kristi just spoke about seems like it might be most useful or most important to you in that project? And we'll give you a second to think about this. It's a great time to also post some questions to that chat box or via our Twitter hashtag as well. It's Sage Talks. If you're not sure, maybe this is something that's really new to you and that you'd like to explore, and this is a great opportunity to get some input from Kristi on this when we get to the Q&A session. All right, let's go ahead and close that. Interesting. Okay, so you've got, you know, focus really is 44%, so a good chunk of people really feel like that's the way to go, and then it would be followed by the vantage with about 20%. Kristi?
Okay, great. That's interesting to hear.
Great.
All right, so now that we've talked about flexibility and moving, I want to unpack it a little bit and think about what that means. We've identified a few dimensions, but let's dive a little deeper into it. Improvisation and a lot of the things that have been written, especially in education, which is my primary field, about improvisation, I think is a helpful touchstone for what it means to be flexible. And I'd like to draw your attention to a quote by Johnny Saldana that says, "Your work must be improvisational, acting, reacting, and interacting with data on a moment-by-moment basis to determine what obstacles stand in your way and what strategies you should take to reach your goal." One of the things I like about this quote is that it talks about the moment-by-moment basis. And I also like this because Johnny Saldana uses a lot of dramaturgical kinds of metaphors, using acting and art and other things, and I think they can be helpful examples. But one of the things I really want to punctuate right here is that flexibility and improvisation don't mean that anything goes. And so even when you're talking about something like improvisational jazz and you don't know what's coming next, there's still a call and response or a structure that frames how the musicians interact. That's the same thing with improvisational comedy and the way maybe suggestions are provided by an audience, but the performer still uses a structure within which to move, and it even applies to improvisational conversation. And even though you don't know where a conversation is going, there are rules around it that help guide the boundaries. And part of the challenge as a researcher is to know how far you can move within those boundaries and being willing and able to articulate when you move beyond them or when you violate some of those norms what your rationale is. So I'm not talking about unbridled flexibility. I'm talking about a kind of disciplined flexibility. So if we talk about moving near and far, and we think about that as part of flexibility with some rules, I think it has to start with understanding some issues around metaphors in everyday life. So I'm switching here for a second to get us grounded in the metaphors of near and far and what I mean when I talk about metaphors in everyday speech. So the simple phrases of I'm in a good mood and I'm feeling a little out of it are phrases that scholars like Lakoff and Johnson call orientational metaphors. They're parts of everyday speech that really have to do with our understanding of the relationship, the spatial relationship between objects and items. And you'll find much more in their book, but one example is the way they use the orientational metaphor of up and down and how those get systematically used. And I'm just going to do an example from the first one here. The idea that happy is up and sad is down can be seen in all sorts of phrases in speech. You could say, I'm on a real high after that presentation. What somebody said really lifted my spirit, or that gift was a real boost. All those things are up and talking about being happy. Whereas someone else might say, I'm feeling a little low, I'm down in the dumps, what somebody did really shut me down. Those are examples of sad being down. Okay, so the idea of orientational metaphors being part of everyday speech is a key part of why I want to pursue closeness and distance. So to talk about closeness and distance in research, I want to start by talking about everyday life, and I'm going to talk about my everyday life. So this is me, my first day of college. I'm from Colorado, and the air is dry here, and I went to college at Kenyon in Ohio, where it's very humid, and I was warned that it was going to be hot and humid. And before I left, I thought, well, no big deal. It's the United States. I'll be fine. It's hot and humid. I had no idea until I got there what that meant because I'd never lived in a climate like that. I'm not kidding. I took 3 showers the first day I was there. So that's one of the examples that I really had to be there. I had to get close to really get it. I have one more example about closeness, and that is my practice of meditation. I haven't been doing it a long time, but I heard about it for years and years. And all the things people said about meditation and what it might do for me can't even touch sort of what it has meant and the ways it's changed the way I've seen things. So doing it was really the way I had to understand what it was going to mean. So these are both about closeness, and I'm using the metaphor of walking in my shoes. Until you walk in my shoes, you don't understand what it's like. And there are 2 examples. Now, I have 2 more examples of distance. I, as I said, live in Colorado, and I love the mountains, but I do notice when people come to visit as outsiders how much they notice it, talk about it, love it, and then I realize when I go to the beach, I do the same thing. I notice really how beautiful it is. It's the problem of being so close that you take things for granted. So sometimes you need to be an outsider to really see things. You need to come from a distance. One other example.
An observation here.
Go
I'm
ahead.
noticing, when you're talking about, the climate change, obviously that was a very instant kind of closeness that you felt the day that you got there. But then with your meditation, I would assume it took you some time to get that closeness.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the other issues about moving near and far is being in tune with the pace at which you're moving near and far. And there's a lot of things that can influence the appropriateness of how fast or how slow that can happen. So I think there's a diverse range around that, and there's no rules that I would assign to when that's appropriate. I just know I've observed it.
Interesting. Okay.
Okay, so the other example of distance I have here is I have a colleague who's incredibly talented, and he just doesn't see it. He doesn't know really how much he contributes to our collegial environment. And it's because he's so close inside his own head, he doesn't see things the way some of us that are his colleagues see things. So that's an example of, we're not inside his head, so we're able to see from a distance his contributions in a way that he sometimes doesn't see. I am playfully calling this the Monday morning quarterback distance. And so that's the distance you get either from time, because something recedes into the past, or, again, because you're changing context, or you're seeing something from a slight distance, where you see things differently, and you do understand it in new and more enriched ways. Now, the left-hand side of my screen has examples that I kind of consider to be more externally driven. They're more about environments or the contexts that we encounter. And the left-hand side I consider to be more personally or interpersonally driven ways of thinking about closeness and distance. So I have these quadrants. That's just a way to start thinking about this. It is by no means the only way, but I'm just trying to help everybody get their heads around for reflecting on everyday practice, reflecting on how you live your life and how you understand things from a close perspective or a distant perspective, and then how to apply that to the practice of qualitative research. Nicole, you okay with me moving ahead, or is there something else you want to clarify?
No, that was great. Thank you.
Okay. So once again, one dimension of research flexibility is this researcher closeness and distance. And what I want to do to help us stay motivated and excited about this practice is to think about qualitative research as a journey. And in particular, I'd like to think about it as an adventure rather than something that's traumatic. So I want to turn this journey into an adventure that's playful, that has meaning, that has consequences. And one of the ways I've seen this in everyday speech among the researchers that I work with, or in my own language, is the way researchers talk about being near things in their journey. So navigating, launching, being in the field, diving in, those are all ways I've heard metaphors being used to talk about the journey and being in it, being close. But there are also ways I've heard people talk about it being far. There could be some distance to it, or you could need distance to look at the data. I've been known many times in my trainings to say that I want to run matrix queries to get a topographical view of the data, to get an aerial view. It's very much like going on a journey and looking at a map. So I see these examples all the time of the way researchers talking about getting near and getting far from the data. The reason this talk was called, or I should say was subtitled, Don't Get Too Comfortable, is because this notion of being near and far is, again, something I want to encourage you to traverse back and forth. And I'm trying to trouble the idea that you need to stake a research claim and defend it too quickly. And I think as researchers, we sometimes rush to this posture because we think we should, when really part of the craft is moving, this movement back and forth. So one of the things I want to emphasize about this near and far, before I get to my last slide here, is that this notion of moving and being near and far are always relative. They're not absolute. That when you move closer to one thing, you move farther from another. So a simple example here, I have this tree, and I might want to look at the tree and consider the, it could be all sorts of things, the height of the tree and the elements of the tree. But there could be a time when I really just want to look at a leaf that's on the tree, and as soon as I focus my attention on that leaf, I'm moving away. I'm getting distance from my look at the tree as a whole. And the same thing is true when I put the leaf down to look at the tree again. So this moving back and forth isn't as though there's a constant near and a constant far. It's always relative depending on what you're moving towards and what you're moving away from. So the last slide I have here is about tips for being able to move and traverse this closeness and distance as you practice qualitative research. Now, some of these I've already talked about, and they're more conceptual. I've put them under this list of conceptually moving near and far. And so again, an example would be if you're looking in your research at an incident, it's good at certain points to push back and to think about how those incidents relate to longer-standing traditions. And if you're studying longer-standing traditions, it's a good idea at some point to push back and observe specific incidents that fall within it. And we could say that about anything in this list, but I am very aware that this list doesn't provide you with much guidance. So these are things to think about. And again, the arrows really should be going both directions instead of one way, or I should create a spiral diagram here so you can see moving back and forth. But I want to end with some practical tips, and I have 5 practical ones. The first one, oh, Nicole, did you want to say something?
I'm sorry, nope, I did not.
Okay, sorry, no worries, I just got a little glitch. So the first one is sensory. There are times when you might be, for instance, using videotapes. It could be that instead of the video, you want to look at a written transcript to see something in a different way. Or it could be that you're watching a videotape of an activity. It could be an amusement park, and you realize that you actually are going to have to go there and experience it to understand what people are experiencing in the video. So I would encourage you to tap into moving around with the different sensory perceptions you have around interacting with your data. So there's the first one. The next one is speed and tempo. I was amazed in one study when I was looking at video. What would happen if I turned off the audio and just watched, or turned away from the video and just listened? And when you watch things in reverse or even mix up the chronological order, it can help you see things in a way you haven't seen it before. The next one is timing, and every good qualitative research I know knows how to put things down and pick them up at the right times. There's times when you need distance. My big caution on this one is that you don't want to conflate timing for procrastination, which some of us can do. And I will, with this one, give you one tip that I used in my dissertation, but I now use it every time I'm in a project. Whenever I'm in those moments of putting the data down for a little while, I always end by writing a journal or a memo that's called "If I Had 4 More Hours." And in that journal or that memo, I write down ideas for what I would do if I was to continue to work for 4 more hours or so. And it could be a list of options, or it could be something I know I need to do next. But it just means that after I take that break and I'm ready to come back to the data, I don't have that anxiety around what if I don't find anything? What if this isn't productive time? I'm feeling so much pressure about getting this done. I know all I have to do is re-engage with that entry, and it'll give me a starting point. I might follow it, I might not, but it's easier to get back into the data. And so the next one is distilling and expanding. There's plenty of literature written on this, how to summarize data and how to take data and expand theories out of it. You can purposefully, while you're handling data, make one of those moves. Decide to do a little distilling or decide to try to do some expanding. And then finally, the literature. You can purposefully, while you're handling data, think about where this connects with what's going on already in the literature and where it diverges. And although I have these 2 lists here as separate lists, the conceptual list and the practical list, I believe they're related. I think they're mutually reinforcing, and I have a tough time imagining you doing something with these different kinds of practical activities to navigate to be flexible and having them not have an impact on some of those conceptual or other conceptual ways of being flexible. So this has been a brief tour of some of my thoughts around flexibility and metaphor and closeness and distance. And once again, I'm really just trying to dislodge the idea that you run to a stance too quickly, that you feel like you have to stand on and defend, that you move when things are getting stale, and that you think about this movement as a way of helping you solve problems and thinking about the data. And I did create a little inspirational 90-second video to really get you in the mood that's on YouTube. If you search YouTube, which we'd rather not have you do now because we're getting ready for some discussion time, but if you search YouTube for closeness and distance in qualitative research, you'll find this. And for those of you that access the slides later, there's a link here to those slides. All right, so with that, I'm going to hand it back to Nicole.
Thank you so much, Kristi. We really appreciate you taking time to share your expertise with us today. Let me just get my slides up real quick, if you would bear with me 1 second.
Sure.
There we go. You see those okay?
Yes, I can.
Great. So we've gotten some great questions along the way here. One person wrote, I'm stuck in a thematic analysis rut, stuck with what I know, and I'm hoping that this will get me thinking broader. Do you have any suggestions for that?
Oh, well, that's great. I'm glad. So, yeah, you know, themes can do that. Thematic analysis can do that. I would say that sometimes that's because thematic analysis can get really descriptive. And it's not that it has to, but themes can be really descriptive about what is happening in that setting. And so to push back and try to think more conceptually, more theoretically, more in, hypotheses and playing around with reasons for things, I think can help you move out of that what's potentially a thematic rut. Just so you know, I see that a lot, and a lot of us who work with qualitative data analysis software, like NVivo, we see that a lot with people who dive into the process, especially if they're new, and they think of coding thematically as the thing that you do with software, when there's a lot of other ways to code and a lot of other things that you can do with the software. So frankly, simply just recognizing that you might be in a thematic rut and trying to push away and think of other ways to think about connections in the data is a helpful moment. So I would just say acknowledge that moment and try to nudge yourself off of it.
Great. Someone has a question about interviews. They ask, how can I keep my composure during interviews? Sometimes a whoa or an oh wants to pop out. How does that influence the interviewee's responses?
Yeah, so I've experienced that too. And I think sort of an important starting point is realizing that in this journey and in this big flexible movement, there's no way that you're not going to influence the participants. You being there is doing that. It's really just a question of how and how that happens. And I found that giving myself permission to make mistakes is a great start, knowing that if I have a reaction or if I have to stop or if I've forgotten the order of the questions, just pausing and saying, I'm sorry, can you just give me a second to think, that can always give me a chance to stop and regroup and say something in a different way. So don't be afraid to do some self-correcting. That's part of the flexibility in the journey, and identify it and just do it. Also, that could be great modeling for your interviewees. If you're willing to stop and say, I'm sorry, that's not what I meant to say, or I didn't mean to make that sound like a judgment, whatever it is that you're seeing yourself do, label it and identify it and tell them you're doing it. And if you pause and stop to think, all those things are then things they're going to feel free to do in the interview. So I would just try to not feel so controlled and give yourself a break would be my advice on that one.
That's great advice. We have someone who's asking here about a distance question. They're working in their dissertation as a principal and their participants are school principals, or excuse me, as a teacher and their participants are school principals. So in that case, what would distance look like, or how far can they be?
Well, it sounds like that's about the distance of the relationship, the distance of,
Yeah.
People in different roles. There's a lot of different ways that people in roles like that can either be close or far. So just I'm not sure if this is exactly where that question is coming from, but just the label of somebody's role. It could, so for instance, it could be that there's a teacher and a principal who work closely together on a particular project, and so they have to navigate, they have to negotiate, they have to communicate, they have differences, and that's one kind of closeness. But it could be that you meet, you're at a conference and you're a principal and you meet a teacher. Then you don't have a prior relationship, but you're related via the role. You have these different titles, and so there's ways you're supposed to perform or supposed to behave. And so there's different kinds of traversing that you can do in those different contexts. That's part of trying to figure out those boundaries of what's okay and what's not okay, and how to gain distance. It could be, it's just occurring to me to call that question, could also be coming from, we're both in this setting, so how do we get distance from it? And one of the strategies I've used when I'm thinking that way is replace. It's amazing what can happen sometimes when you look at a phrase or a comment or an approach to something, and you find an adjective in a sentence and replace it with something else, or find a role that somebody's taking and replace it with something else. It's a juxtaposition that shakes you off of your view because you insert something that doesn't belong. I think Irving Goffman in sociology is the person I often turn to with this because he did it for so long in so many ways. So I don't know. There's just kind of two different answers to that question. I hope I addressed what that person was asking, but if not, we can try to address it later.
We will post your email address at the end of the presentation, and if they didn't, they can certainly let you know.
Okay, great.
We have another question around closeness here. Closeness related to data. Does that apply to your data? Transcribing services are available, but you're transcribing your own data. Does that give you a deeper immersion?
All right, you betcha. Right, every part of handling data is going to have some aspect of this moving close and far, and you'll get people arguing in both directions on this. So again, I want to emphasize, when you get close to this in one way, you're potentially getting far from it in another way, and it's important just to know what you're getting far from. So if you transcribe your own data, you hear it in a different way, you re-engage with it again, and that's great. But you could also be pushing yourself away from an understanding that you might be getting if you send it away for transcription, and while that's happening, you focus your attention on something else, like another study where somebody did something similar, and you want to see what they did and what they found and what those people said. You're getting closer to that study as a frame, but you're getting farther away from your own transcripts, and then you have to decide when to get back to your transcripts when they come back from getting transcribed. So again, trying not to think of this in absolutes, just being aware of when you move close in one direction, what are you moving far from? And I think new researchers, a lot of people will say it's good for you to transcribe, and I think I agree with that. It's good to transcribe a few interviews if you've never done it before, because then you understand some of the decisions you're making while you're transcribing that you might not be aware of when you have somebody else do it. But I would never put a rule in place that you always have to, or you're going to be far from your data. I think that's simplifying it too much.
Makes sense. We have a question around your insider-outsider model. This person's research is related to the pedagogical aspects of journalistic ethics. Their study entails interviews with a representative for the National Council for the Training of Journalists, the head of the journalist department at a university, a senior lecturer on the undergraduate and postgraduate journalism programs, and a student who has recently completed the top segment of her MA in sport journalism. Do you feel like that's in line with the insider-outsider model that you were talking about?
So that sounds great. Sounds interesting. So I would say, that's starting. That sounds to me like starting a position of looking at an insider view, and that it might be worthwhile at some point to think about how to nudge along that spectrum to look at things from an outsider perspective. I'm not saying you have to go full tilt here and try to look at things from an outsider view, just that it might be helpful to move a little bit. One way to make that movement that I've used a lot in the interviews that I've conducted is you actually ask the insiders what they think the outsiders think of them. So you say, do you think this group of people would agree with what you said? And if they disagree, what would they say? And it forces some of those insiders to adjust and to kind of look at that periphery and at least try to articulate it from their point of view. And just doing that could point you in the outsider direction. It can help push you towards that periphery of who you might want to talk to or what you might want to read, who's critical of the very things that your insiders say are wonderful, just to move a little bit, just to get a different view.
That makes sense. We've got a couple of questions that are sort of related here. What are your go-to explanations for validating qualitative data analysis to research team members who are strictly quantitative-minded? And in the same vein, are there any suggestions that you have for working with mixed methods team members who are maybe less comfortable with flexibility and induction?
Yeah, boy, these are good. Those are hard. I just for whoever asked those, I've been there.
Yeah.
So, there's probably people who've done more scholarship on, validity that might be worth reading, and there's a lot of resources, on instead of thinking about validity, thinking about things like trustworthiness and confirmability and those kinds of things. But I tell you what, I experience a lot around this question of validity, and especially with teams, is it's actually about reliability. And I do think sometimes when it comes to qualitative research, people are applying these in different ways and maybe mixing the way they talk about it. But my concern about thinking about like coder reliability in qualitative research is that it's really easy to focus on being reliable and to sacrifice a valid view. So you could be teaching people to be very consistently inaccurate, and I think that can happen a lot with coding, and that there are different views. There's a lot of people who view different viewpoints on the data as part of what gives it strength. So to think that there's one valid view is a problematic starting point. In the In Vivo book that I co-authored with Pat Baisley, one of the things that we talk about is if somebody is coding and they spend all their time talking to other researchers about definitions for codes and what those codes are, etc., they could be missing really valuable insights. And I worked on a project that we also talk about in the book where the principal investigator, there were a couple of us on the team, but I'm a white woman and there was another black female who's a coder, and we came from different viewpoints. And the principal investigator very purposefully did not want us to code to the same coding structure. And that was because she wanted to make sure the richness of those different viewpoints got captured during the coding process. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying that then you don't have to reconcile it somehow, but it's realizing the utility in those different viewpoints and moving off this notion that there's only one valid view. There could be multiple interesting views to take on the data and to come up with findings. I don't know if that'll work. I understand that this person was asking, how do I talk to some of the researchers who aren't of that mindset? I'm not sure if those examples will be helpful or not, but that's how I try to approach it.
I think if you had cracked that, then you would be in a different place at this point. I think it's a long-standing issue.
Yeah.
We have some questions around interviewees who may be a bit elusive, particularly around professionals who escape answering questions or divert the agenda of research, or maybe somebody's just not answering the question that you asked and starts to go on about something else. Do you have ideas for addressing rogue interviewees, if you will?
So, yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess, yeah, there's two things to balance here, which is another flexibility in how you're traversing. One is, so one end of the spectrum is, I need to get these questions answered. How do I redirect?
Mm-hmm.
And the other is, where could this be taking me that I'm resisting right now? And maybe I should follow. So the redirection part, I think all the things that we've learned from counselors about using I statements and rephrasing and taking ownership for where you are in the conversation can be helpful ways of letting the participant know that you hear, and you say, I hear you say this, I'm hearing you say this, I'm hearing you say this, but what I'm wondering about is that, and you go back to your question. So you're honoring that they've just given you something. You're rephrasing it so they've heard you and you've heard them, and then try to nudge it back. So I would use those same kinds of strategies. But honestly, more than that, I think we often dig our heels in and feel like I've got to get through this interview guide. I've got to direct them. And it's really good to think about if they're not following your interview guide, it's great for you to stop and think why. What's going on with them that they want to go this direction instead? Because that could be really important information. So why are they going?
I assume, too, that with a lot of experience, you'll have a sense of whether or not you should be following the path they're taking you down, or if you really do need to redirect. And that's so hard to know until you practice it.
It is, and we got to give ourselves a break. This happens to me almost every study. The first few interviews aren't fantastic. The first few interviews are not usually the ones where I have the best rapport and we're getting through things, because you learn things as you go, you figure out different ways to say things, you figure out different metaphors or examples to use, and so, yeah, it's not always perfect. So that's another place you just got to give yourself a break and keep trying to learn and reflect afterwards on what worked well and what didn't work well.
We have another question here around doing research that may be personal. So someone says, I'm always concerned that my pre-existing ideas will bias either the collection or data analysis. What do you do to help prevent this self-fulfilling prophecy? And likewise, someone else asked, do you have any tips related to closeness and distance when you have counter-transference with your data? For example, I'm a mom of a child with a disability doing a disability research. I tend to overcompensate in interviews for distance sometimes. How do you handle those?
Those are great questions, and so I would once again say, remember when you're getting close in one way, it just means you're getting distant in another way, and as soon as you try to get away from that, as soon as you try to take some distance, it means you're actually getting closer to something else and farther away from your personal experience, and they could have equally beneficial and problematic implications. So there's not some measuring stick for this is too close and I shouldn't be there and I need to move. I want to encourage people to instead, if you're feeling that criticism or the need to adjust your role, instead of self-flagellation and punishing yourself from the position you're in and needing to move, acknowledge the things that you gain and the things that you lose as soon as you try to move your position. I think sometimes one of the things that helps when people are really close to their research topic is talking to others. And so if you're feeling isolated, if this is your experience, and if you're in the data all the time, and the more you can push out and have conversations with people who both know you and care about what you think, but who can also be honest with you, having those conversations can help you see things in different ways and can help you push, and they can even help brainstorm ways to push back. So I think that's the thing I encounter the most when people are doing autoethnographic work or really close to what they're studying. I think in general, if you're feeling too close, the most likely reason is you haven't been talking to anybody. And so just pushing back and figuring out who to have a conversation with about it can help you see things in different ways and push back in certain ways.
Very helpful advice. When I'm looking at some of these questions, people are asking about resources or references for certain things that you talked about, like the distill and expand process or the dropped out versus pushed out. I think you had included some information at the beginning of the webinar that'll be in the PowerPoint slides that might be helpful for that, but can you think of any other resources that you'd like to recommend to the group?
Well, you know, I can probably put some together afterwards to help folks as well. You know, this wasn't even any of the things you just listed, but one of the things actually I would recommend is Thomas Schwann's Dictionary of Qualitative Inquiry is actually a way I found myself traversing back and forth within that book to get close and far from things, because it cross-references different terms and different words and different ways of thinking. So as a source of information that you can move around in to understand what's going on in qualitative research, I would certainly go there, because there's sections on everything from epistemology, and I can't even remember, there probably is something on data distillation. So that's one place I would go. But I'm happy to sort of think through some examples, especially, you know, after I look at some of these questions afterwards, of places to go for more resources.
That would be great. Someone else is asking, how can I take a break from my data while we are working with our dissertation? Yeah,
it's hard. Well, you know, sometimes
I like your 4-hour suggestion.
Yeah, what I would do if I had 4 more hours. The other thing is, so these breaks happen different ways. So sometimes a break is realizing you've been sitting for 3 hours and needing to set a timer to make sure that you stand up for 15 minutes and go for a walk, or, you know, lie down flat on your back to stretch out, because your body starts getting so oppressive in the, you know, sitting in front of the data. So some of them are, some of that taking a break is just brief in the moment, and some of it is much longer. I found it very difficult to get through my dissertation until I took what I called dissertations. So I would set up a vacation where I was going somewhere where I didn't know anybody, and I managed to do them fairly cheap. And I did these several times. I did this a good 6 or 7 times probably during the course of my analysis, of where I really went away and focused. Once again, I was getting away from my local context, so I wasn't so distracted, and I could focus on the dissertation. And it meant when I left, then I could let that sit for a while and get back to some of my everyday activities. Now, so I did that, but I know some people, I know a lot of faculty who say, you know, make sure you write at least 15 minutes in the first thing in the morning to get started, or write for an hour a day. And that write an hour a day thing never worked for me, because I really needed to carve out 5 or 6 days at a time when I knew I could just think about this and just work on it. So it's hard, and it's different for different people, but I would play with knowing yourself, what works for you in other contexts. So don't think about your dissertation. Think about planning a family vacation, and when you enjoy it and how it works, and when it becomes oppressive and you need to not think about it for a while. It doesn't have to be the dissertation. Just think about something else where you have learned to take breaks. And what are they? Are they short? Are they long? Are they once a day? Is it once a month? So I would have people look at their own personalities to try to observe taking breaks in other contexts and see what works and apply it to the dissertation.
I like that. Dissertations, and maybe we'll have thesis moons too. The people are asking about the book that you recommended. It's called The Sage Dictionary of Qualitative Inquiry. I think that's the one you meant, by Thomas Schwant. Is that right?
Correct. Yes, that's correct. And I can't even remember what version it's on now. He's revised it.
It came out in its 4th edition in January. And again, you can use Jackson 20 altogether at checkout for that 20% discount on any of the books. And you're welcome to check out any of the qualitative resources on the SAGE website. That discount will be applied to them. So certainly use that. I'm afraid we have to wrap up our time today. I want to thank everyone for joining us for the talk, and especially Kristi for putting all of this content together and for making herself available to you after the webinar and putting her information up here in case you have questions that you'd like to direct to her. We'll have her answer some of the questions that came in. I'm just hearing from our coordinator that we've received more questions on this webinar than any other talk that we've ever done. So congratulations, Kristi. You've started a qualitative dialogue.
Maybe people disagree with me. Maybe that's all people who disagree. I don't know. I'll wait till I see them.
No, they all need help, I think.
Well, thanks so much to Nicole and your team for helping to organize this. You guys have done a great job.
Absolutely. We're so happy you could be here. If you have any questions or want to look at more information, you can go to sagepub.com/sagetalks, and you can also find a list there of any upcoming webinars as they become available. Thank you so much for your time today, everyone, and we'll send that email around with the PowerPoint slides and the link to the recording of this webinar if you'd like to use it for future. Okay? Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day.